So, as you mentioned, I published Fight Aging, which was originally intended to be something of a dial tone for the conversation about longevity back in the day when nobody was talking about aging and treating aging as a medical condition. I think I could probably fall under a bus today and it wouldn't matter too much on that front, but I still find it useful for myself, if not for everybody else, to continue just poking around and looking at what's going on and try to keep a flow of things going. It seems to help. So beyond that, I work at Repair Biotechnologies. I lead the company. You know how it goes: CEO, fundraising, and delegation, nothing else. And we're trying to reverse atherosclerosis. So what that means is that we have an approach that absolutely definitively reverses atherosclerosis in mice, and we are working to package it in a way that will be palatable to the combination of the FDA and investors to bring it forward to the clinic. And if everything goes swimmingly, hopefully clinical trials by late 2023. And of course, if you have money, I'm happy to accept it to put it towards this wonderful, wonderful goal of ending the cause of death for a quarter of humanity. So other than that, I'm also an active self-experimenter. I like to try to fill in gaps in our understanding. And I have a body, I might as well use it. It's getting older. Try to do something about that. And I also pester people a lot about coming in and trying to do things that I don't have the time to do, such as starting businesses to go and deliver dasatinib and quercetin to as many people as possible, or running clinical trials on a philanthropic basis for therapies that will never get picked up by the commercial industries because there's no way to put IP on them, and other sort of general gadfly type stuff. And that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Thank you. Okay, then maybe to kick off discussion, I would love to just share, which is a slide that you have at least submitted or have allowed me submit by filling in your information on this. So I basically what we've done throughout the entire Vision Weekend is we had different people fill in their individual notes so that over time we can create a technology tree from them. Obviously, that serves two purposes. A, it's a good plot device so that people actually have it in writing what other people are working on and can see how they may be able to fit in. And I asked you the question by email. I filled in your slide. So do you want to explain a little bit on what it is?
Sure. So I actually ended up filling this in with a pencil in the meeting on like a church bench, which is probably why you couldn't read half of it. So I obviously work in the field with our therapy at Repair is essentially a gene therapy. Though that also means you can be a cell therapy because you could choose to transduce the cells outside the body and deliver those instead. And like everybody who works in this field, I find the existing state of the art for gene therapies to be frustrating, to say the least. I think there might be a perception out there in the world that, wow, gene therapy is a thing, we can do it. There is no such thing as a good gene therapy. What we have at the moment are various square pegs that can be brutally hammered into the various round holes they need to be in. The problem that one has is 100% targeting, because you want to be able to deliver enough of your vector to the target, and ideally as little of your vector as possible to everywhere else, so there are no off-target effects. And most of what you want to do with gene therapies in aging are going to require systemic gene therapies that are injected via IV and only go or actively go to some place in the body. So your current set of gene, and then once there, they exist for some period of time. And your current choices are gene therapies that will cause major problems if you try to do that for most targets in the body, because too much of it will go to the liver. Gene therapies where you can't restrict the activation of the cargo to specific areas or specific parts of the body. Things that last for not long enough, like mRNA, which only lasts for a few days to a week, when what you really want is months of expression. Things that last for too long, like AAV, which will last for years when maybe you only want months of expression. And a bunch of other tools where people say, hey, this works great, but actually it doesn't. Because when it comes around to trying to get it to work properly, nobody's replicated it well. And then there's some great tools that nobody's actually put past the FDA yet. And when you're running a company, the first thing you do is look at the tool options and say, who's put this option through the FDA, so that you're not the first person to try to convince them that this is actually going to work. And there's this game you play where you go look at clinical trials and you count the number of clinical trials for option A versus option B. And it doesn't matter how good option A is. If it has 2 clinical trials and no approvals, where option B has 15 clinical trials and 3 approvals, you're going with option B, and you just make that square peg fit the round hole. What we desperately need in order to advance the state of the industry is an 80-20 gene therapy that just works for most applications, where you can just say, I can inject this thing in high volume. It won't annoy the immune system. It won't harm your liver. It will only activate in the tissues you want. And it will basically work for most therapies with very little tinkering. Right now, you really do have to spend. There's an entire industry, for example, for AAV, viral gene therapies, that is focused on really spending, it will cost you 18 months and maybe $10 million in order to get a factor of 2, unless you get lucky, a factor of 2 improvement in the efficacy, the efficiency of your gene therapy. And you want that factor of 2, because it means you can inject half as much as you otherwise would have, and therefore you get less liver toxicity. That's really important, and people spend a lot of money on this, and this is silly. We need to cut this all out and just have a gene therapy that just works. And there's a couple of roads forward to this that might work. Lipid nanoparticles and plasmids are a potential path forward, where you may be able to get things that are able to have promoter-driven activation of the cargo, such that you can control it much more accurately in terms of where it expresses in the body. And these nanoparticles can be made sufficiently non-toxic that you can inject rather large amounts of them without aggravating the body. But we're nowhere near where we need to be on this. They're just better than the past at the moment. So this is my aggravation that I bring to high net worth individuals who want to come into the industry and do something big. It's like, come on, gather up the pieces, build the gene therapy of the future, the platform that will allow you to actually use gene therapy, that will create 1,000 companies overnight coming out there and doing every possible thing that can be done with modifying genes. The future of medicine is not small molecules. It is gene therapies, because gene therapies, if you could deliver them cost effectively in a non-toxic way, are so much more accurate and so much more controllable than any small molecule approach could ever be. We just don't have the tools to enable that yet. We're stumbling around like cavemen with giant clubs, trying to hit diseases over the head with these things. And early AAV stuff, it works if you're targeting skeletal muscle or if you're targeting the liver. But if for example you're somebody like me who wants to target the thymus, good luck. Your only path forward is direct injection, and direct injection is not a viable path for most internal organs, because your mortality rate is going to be quite high in old people. 0.1%, 0.2%. That's about what the fine needle aspiration mortality or serious complication rate is for internal organs. And if you're doing something that's not for a very, very serious disease, you just can't float that sort of mortality rate with the FDA and expect to get somewhere, or even with the investors who will just look at that and shrug. So we need to do a lot better than we can right now. And the end of the day, what you can do with that is just anything you can put your mind to. My particular project right now, where we reverse atherosclerosis by degrading cholesterol where it accumulates in excess in the body, you can't do this with small molecules, period. End of story. There's just no way to do this with any conceivable small molecule approach, because cholesterol is used everywhere in the body. You need something that is as complex as a cell to come in and actually do the work in a safe way and only degrade the excess cholesterol. And if you need a cell, you need a way to program that cell. You need genes and proteins and so forth. And this is true for a lot of things in the body. If you want to restore elastin, elastin is a really complicated project. It has a very, very ornate structure. You can't just go in there and tinker with things. You need to program cells to go and do the right job. And, there's a lot of stuff in aging that's like this. You need a complex worker on the site in order to actually affect things in the way you want to affect them, whether that's some form of repair or reconstruction or etc. So gene therapies are the future, and they're necessary for an awful lot of the treatment of aging. We got very lucky with senolytics, in that that's a nicely small molecule suited problem, because you're just killing cells. But most of our problem with aging is not that. It's somewhat more complicated indeed. So that's kind of my view of how that whole thing pans out. And then separately, what was the thing I asked for as somebody, please solve this thing?
Better remote. Well, let me
Oh
actually.
yes, that right. Yes. So um, I have a little experience of running remote operations back in the software industry, and that's easy. You just set up a good telecommunication system, and everybody gets on Zoom, and you don't care whether your coworker is the floor up in the building, so you can go up and complain with them directly, or happens to be in Siberia. Either of those works. Lab work is lab work. It really matters, and you really actually do need to be there in person. Um, we had like a sort of 30-day problem in trying to get something to work, which turned out to be at one point, because the person who was actually performing the work was too slow in closing the top of a tube. He was taking 30 seconds. He should have taken 10 seconds. And this derailed an entire project for a month, because and this sort of thing you can never write in a protocol. And if you put a protocol and gave it to a CRO and said, go do this, you'd be there for months trying to figure out what they were doing and whether it was going wrong. And if you have a remote worker, you're never going to figure that out. It's impossible. Our CSO splits his time between his family home in Toronto and our lab in Syracuse. And things go a lot faster when he's down here in Syracuse, I can tell you, because he's peering over people's shoulder and seeing things like, hey, you should have closed that tube faster. I mean, that's an obvious example, but there's a lot of others that show up in this business of bench work being a very, very hands-on job. It's one of the most hands-on job, because it's infinite detail just laid end on end, and a good lab worker is a machine, and they're doing exactly the same thing over and over, and no protocol can be like comprehensive enough to describe every single thing that you have to know in order to get something to work right. And half the time you're discovering how to get it to work right. I mean, we aim as a company doing development to never do any research. So of course we end up doing about 50% research, because that's the way the world works. And you just can't do this remotely. So there's companies right now that are trying to make brave stabs at how do you do remote bench work. And for any meaningful job, they will all fail. There is no way you can do this without full telepresence or something very close to that. And even then, I'm dubious. So, but it's an inventive world, and at some point we need to allow the bench work community, the biotech community, because while I know there's an awful lot of focus on software in this community, 99% of the important stuff in biotech is hands-on wet lab work. That is the thing that moves the field forward, not the bioinformatics, not the infrastructure technologies. It's guys in a lab poking at cells and getting things done. So if we're going to allow the sort of same explosion of value across the country and the world from the current tech centers for biotech to occur, and I think we need a way to enable that industry to operate in the same way as the tech industry does, to where remote work is a possibility and disparate bench work areas collaborating with one another seamlessly is a possibility. And I don't know how to do this because my experience is that you simply cannot have any sort of remote capabilities or interaction in a company without running into enormous problems that will slow you down immensely. So somebody please solve this problem.
Great challenge. And you already have some comments here in the chat, and this is probably also something for our Intelligent Cooperation group to take on. We have a comment from Nicola. Go for it.
Yeah, I don't know why I kept my hand up, because those were lots of elements. When you were speaking about the AAV, it's not one solution. AAV, for example, the way you will transfect depends on the promoters that you would use, depends on the size of the inserts that you're going to put in it. It's just one technique. And so I don't see how AAV by itself would be the solution to gene therapies and AIDS.
It isn't.
There's so many other methods that one can use, but I think that the important element that you were raising in there, that was my take on this, there's lots of methods that are available, but are not of interest and are not being taken because they're not protected by intellectual property. And therefore, no one wants to pay $80 million for doing the FDA approval. So I was wondering if there's a business approach that can be similar to what the generic medicine field is. You know, you have for medicines, you end up with a generic after a few years, and there's lots of companies that specialize in generic, and they can make money out of that. So if we can set up a structure that will be a non-profit, that will evaluate different potential therapies and do the approval, then you can have companies which will be interested to license those technologies and implement them and provide the convenience. So there's two elements into a company. You either are providing something that's novel and exclusive, and obviously for that you have to have the financial incentives, or you're providing convenience, and that's the generic company. You're making something that no one else was making, and you're selling it to the people that are happy to buy. But before that, someone needs to pay for the approvals, and that can be done with nonprofits, and who identify those aspects and do the research. That comes to tag a little bit on someone was speaking about how aging markers should be attached to any medical study that is being done now. We're collecting blood. We have the markers. We should get that data in and see what's happening.
I'm curious as to what you think a good gene therapy approach is that does not have patent protection at the moment.
Yeah, well, everything that's new, people try to protect it, and there has been a decision that's been made that everything is being kept so tightly. But my point was not about going around patent protection. My point was for when there's no interest into developing patented technology, to push this through approval from the FDA if there is a market out there, because there might be a generic company that would be happy to provide the convenience and develop the technology once the technology is approved.
Well, I will give one example, which is why I think that's probably not a terribly interesting path, no offense intended, which is Entos. They're Entos Pharmaceuticals, which is they're tied at the hip to Ocean, working on senescent cell clearance, but their lipid nanoparticles are basically good, better than what came before. They do really very little other than develop this new lipid nanoparticle formulation that is just better than what came before. And they have, $100 million figure deals going constantly now. There's no shortage of money if you develop a better gene therapy. You will have pharma and governments lining up to give you enormous amounts of money to actually push that forward. There's a real hunger for that sort of thing.
All right, we have a few more people here in the queue, and Nicola, obviously feel free to chime in if you want to do a counterpoint to this, even in the chat. We had Anton and Steve.
Who's up next with questions here, Steve?
Anton.
So Anton, okay. In terms of
You're very quiet. I don't think that's just me, but maybe turn up your volume.
You're very quiet. You need to be closer to the mic.
Yes.
Is it okay now?
Yes.
Now it's very loud, but yeah, go for it.
It's a kind of annoying thing from Zoom that by default it puts very low voice. Regarding the comment, I totally agree that there are some, I would say, infrastructural things that, for example, like is to make a gene therapy that is a bottleneck for aging research, because we critically develop on how many, I mean, aging needs very complex interventions, and we are more dependent on the ease of complex interventions than any other biotech field. It's similar to what, for instance, clean meat depends on growth factors and price of medium. And in case of clean meat, they actually put a lot of community work to find ways to bring medium and growth factors costs down for the whole industry. So like many nonprofits like New Harvest or Good Food Institute, they actually put some extra work to make it easier and cheaper. And I think maybe as an aging research industry, we have to actually come up with the major bottlenecks and work hard on actually making them easier to do. For example, it's not only like how easy you can do complex gene therapy, but other things. For example, like just a cell bank of cells of long-living organisms like whales. If a lab wants to work with like whale cell culture or any other long-living animal cell culture, it cannot, because there are no like shared cell bank. And when you try to approach it academically, it looks like not very interesting study because it's a descriptive study. You just make an infrastructure. It's not really interesting paper to publish. But for the aging community, it's like a small endeavor that can be helpful for many, and same can be done in with gene therapies, because like for plasmid, there is like a non-profit called AdGene, and everybody is using AdGene and make quite complex constructs with it. Maybe we need something similar for nanoparticles and viral preps, where we can quite quickly actually get something complex for our therapies, and probably the community should drive it.
So firstly, I think you can lower the volume by about half there. Secondly, there is AdGene is only good for academics. You really can't use AdGene in for-profit work based on their license. But what the for-profit world has is a collection of companies that are doing relatively cheap work for a whole bunch of things. So it's just a question of finding the right one. We use Vector Builder a lot, who've really crushed down the cost of doing all sorts of vector preps and plasmids and other various things. And they're fairly fast and reliable in the grand scheme of things. So it's out there. There are definitely tooling groups that give you good enough. I mean, it does need another factor of 10. Anything to do with viral vectors definitely needs another factor of 10 reduction in cost. But a lot of that is more GMP related problems. The sort of manufacturing process put on AAV by the FDA is just really very, very onerous. And in the case of AAV, which is not true for everything, by the way, in the case of AAV, there just is really not a great deal of practical difference between GMP and research grade materials. Obviously, there's a very practical difference from the point of view of the FDA, but from the point of view of somebody going out there and just getting it done, no. Your odds of getting something bad out of it are pretty low. So I think Stephen also had a question, or he has the hand up here.
Yes. When you made a comment earlier about proprietary technologies relating to gene therapies. And, my view on that is that there's a lot of generic technologies that underlie the efficacy issues that relate to proprietary therapies. So for example, if you put mRNA into a cell, if that cell is zinc deficient, you're going to get an inhibition of protein synthesis. And so, how does that pose a problem to companies that may be developing a proprietary technology, but not see an end-run risk that relates to a generic therapy?
So the end run risk, I assume there you mean somebody comes along and bypasses your patent with one of their own and then runs out and competes with you and makes your life difficult? Question mark.
Or just that they figure out a way to do it with generic technologies and bypass you with something that isn't patentable.
Well, I mean, that's actually really a problem for a lot of groups, but in practice, whether it's a problem or not, it seems to be very domain specific. If you look at, for example, the groups that are doing recombinant protein therapies, all of these guys, to a first approximation, are going into the FDA with a variant of or a fragment, or some optimized version of the protein in question. There really isn't that much better than the actual protein itself. So why are these people getting away with it when any idiot could come along and put in a therapy with just the original protein? And the answer is that the FDA doesn't like it if you turn up with a therapy that's one micro measure worse than what is currently going on there. It's not a great protection, but it's what passes for what goes on right now. Other than that, it is very domain specific. If somebody, it's hard to say without specific examples. Micah asked about the recent directed evolution study in which somebody produced a really, really great result with AAV in terms of finding a capsid and et cetera, that actually is sort of 10x better or 40x better than the generic AAV 8 or 9 approach, which is actually an unfeasibly large result. It's not what you'd expect to get out of any of this sort of effort. You're looking for 2x or 3x gains, but that they could do that suggests that maybe there's some life left in AAV, and that people will maybe turn out things that are really, really good in AAV, and that will give some boost to efforts like those of Selecta Biosciences and other folk who are trying to make AAV non-immunogenic and repeatable by various strategies that are more or less interesting. So I think AAV will continue to be competitive in some sense for a time, even though it is stupidly expensive and really only something you can use for rare diseases at this point in time. But if somebody came up with a use, I mean, if we, for example, if Repair Biotechnologies went forward with AAV, which we're not going to, by the way, but if we did, for the orphan indication of homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, which is an accelerated form of atherosclerosis, and got great results there, same as we did in mice. And we would then have a situation where you have a rare disease being treated with an AAV at ridiculous expense, but it could be used off-label for anybody with atherosclerosis. Would that put enough pressure on the current system to move forward more rapidly towards, disruptive factor of 10 cost reductions in AAV, as similarly happened to monoclonal antibodies back in the day? I don't know. It's sort of a moot question, but at some point, maybe somebody else will find themselves in that position and choose to go forward with AAV. It's sort of chicken and egg situation. AAV can be good for some things and could be greater, but so long as it's relegated to this ultra expensive niche of only rare diseases, and never mind what the FDA is going to tell you if you turn up with an enhancement therapy with AAV rather than, fixing a broken gene for an inherited disease, then maybe we can manage to get somewhere with this. But getting through that roadblock probably will require philanthropy of some sort, as that's usually the case for these sorts of scenarios.
If someone was like, if you could concretize the whole thing, and if someone was really wanting to make an impact, like what would be, let's say this was a philanthropist listening to this, what would they do? Or what are the next steps? They're like, yep,
Well, actually, I had this conversation with a very high net worth individual that I won't name like a year ago. He was looking for where could he make a difference. And I said, look, if you're going to try if your goal is to build the best gene therapy platform to enable a whole new industry, you're going to have to start by holding conferences. Go set up a conference, get all the gene therapy people in there, get them talking, put your boot on the table and say, look, this is what I want. How do we go about doing this? Here's my stack of money. This can be going towards research or research prizes or getting more conferences going. But the first step is to get everybody talking about it and to learn what does academia and industry think the best approach is, what is needed in order to, and you'll get 50 opinions from 50 people, and hopefully somewhere in there one can sort out what needs to be done, where you can introduce some money into the system to actually accelerate things. And this is, people have done this before. It's not rocket science. It's just a lot of work. I mean, it's exactly what the SENS Research Foundation has been doing for various different parts of the field, and other people before them outside of our field have decided, how do you actually speed things up? And starting by holding a big conference is not a terrible way to go.
Are there any other topics that you want big conferences to be held on, where you think this is a really undervalued area, like the laundry list?
Well, honestly, how do you fund trials in a way that is sane? Because the FDA makes it really hard. And what we want is a world in which, where you turn up these therapies such as, I mean, I have a list. It's if you turn up therapies such as, fecal microbiota transplantation or flagellin immunization or dasatinib and quercetin or, all of these other things that are low-hanging fruit, where it's unlikely that they will progress in the for-profit system because you can't get good enough IP on these things. But the FDA has determined that they're probably going to make life difficult for people who try to do this just off-label or just doing it anyway. Certainly fecal microbiota transplantation in particular is in a very weird, nebulous, gray legal area where the FDA would step in if anybody got very aggressive about trying to expand use. So how do you best proceed with this idea of getting all this money that's floating out there in the hands of people who actually really care about moving forward the state of the art in parts of medicine, and transfer it to people who can responsibly run these trials and publish the results and get them out there in a way that people will, that the physician community and other large sources of funding will pay attention to. So you need a reputable sort of, one model is a reputable nonprofit that does nothing but run these trials and publishes them and does it in such an above board way that people will look at it and say, yep, this is the real deal. If they ran a 200-person trial and got a result, we should probably listen to that. And then, even just dasatinib and quercetin, you could run 100 trials for 100 different age-related indications, plausibly right now, based on what we know. These drugs could be used very widely as statins, and they're not being, because nobody's run those trials. And for dasatinib and quercetin, nobody is going to. For 80% of the diseases that one could treat with this in a very reasonable way based on the animal data, nobody is ever going to run those trials within the next sort of 20-year horizon, because every single company doing a senolytic of some sort will tap out at about 2 or 3 indications before they sell out to pharma. And after that, off-label use proceeds very slowly and fragmentedly. We need to make that go faster. And how do you do that with a non-profit and all the money that's floating around looking for ways to make things faster? That would be a good conference to have, I think.
Okay, conference number 2. Nicola has a point on this before we go down the laundry list further.
Yeah, I just am happy that you ended up agreeing with what I was suggesting, to have a nonprofit that runs the trials and then offer the opportunity to businesses start as a service, as a generic, to provide the solution. there is an example for something similar in the field of supplements, where there's very low levels of trust. And in general, people don't like supplements because they don't even know if what they're being sold is exactly what's in the bottle. And so you have Thorne, to name them, who are reputable for having clinical grade tasted supplements that actually sell you exactly the thing that they promised to sell you. So, and they have a reputation, they're making lots of money on selling supplements. So if someone is able to do the research and validation of technologies for aging, then there will be companies who will come and will provide those therapies as a service, and make a business model out of that.
With the caveat that there is a difference between repurposed therapies such as dasatinib and quercetin, which are legal and can be used off-label, and something like fecal microbiota transplantation or flagellin immunization, which is, you know, demonstrably safe, quite widely used, and yet the FDA would require the full spectrum of trials to allow it to be used in the US. Not to mention, I mean, if we take the Intervene Immune example, Greg Fahy's attempt to rejuvenate the thymus, they are literally using a combination of things that are approved, and the FDA's opinion on that is that that's a new drug and they need to do trials. So, you know, the FDA is just a weird organization, and the best way to think of them is that their belief is that any cost in human death and any cost in money is acceptable to avoid any commission of harm. And a lot of their actions make a lot more sense if you view them through that lens, without sort of debating how reasonable that lens is. And then, you know, there are some human foibles on top of that in that different parts of the FDA have different opinions, and it's sort of a luck of the draw as to who you end up talking to on any given day. But that would be why getting out of the US is sometimes good for some things. For dasatinib and quercetin, no, you can do that all in the US if you wanted to, because off-label is a thing. For fecal microbiota transplantation, that's tough. That might have to be something that went through the medical tourism industry, and you may have to look at setting up a responsible nonprofit. Solve the problem of how do you create a trusted entity that is outside the US and trusted inside the US.
Well, the problem is that if you're trying to run away of the FDA, first, that what the FDA is applying is the Hippocratic oath, first do no harm. But if you try to run away from the FDA and make it up to scale, there will be new laws which will make that probably those people will lose their health care back in America. So maybe that's not a solution. Tourism is not a solution. You know, going to Cuba to buy your cheaper insulin is not a solution at scale. Specifically for the fecal transplants, that's the best possible treatment of C. diff. It's invented in the 1700s. Okay, why is the FDA being a pain in the implanting region? Well, there is reasons, and there's one should look at the question and solve the specific problem. Why the FDA would not accept fecal transplant as a treatment for aging?
Oh, they would totally accept it at the end of the day, not for aging itself, setting aside the TAME trial, but you know, you could do it for some indication that where chronic inflammation was important in. The point is you'd have to spend the money to get them to accept it. And that's the problem, because you can't patent protect robustly fecal microbiota transplantation. And if you can't patent protect it, you can't control the future revenue stream. You can't convince investors to give you the money that you need in order to pass the trials. That's kind of why all these conditions don't move forward. I think John had a question.
I just have a comment on FDA approval, which isn't always just for preventing harm or safety. Part of what FDA approval that might be the case in the TRIM trial is whether you can make a valid claim of thymus rejuvenation with this combination of things that are approved for other indications.
Right. The FDA cares about efficacy as well as safety, though. You know, most of the decisions on whether to proceed or not, funnily, are actually around the safety, cost of GMP, that sort of stuff is my take on things.
I posted a little bit more info on the FDA session that we have with Chris Leptak here in case people want some context. Well, one of the challenges that you had on the longevity challenges document that I shared also here in the chat, if we just go down the laundry list, was just much better immune rejuvenation. And you listed a few things, which is regeneration of the thymus, rejuvenation of youthful hematopoiesis, and targeted removal of pathogenic peripheral immune population. So do you want to say a few words about that too? Because I know
sure. That's actually, this is one of the things we'll see very soon, I think, for some definition of very soon, because all the pieces are out there and can be worked on or are being worked on. Ship of Theseus is a company that's working on ways to restore hematopoietic function, and they're not the only ones. And this is really, this is something that could be sorted out with some form of cell therapy. There are small molecule approaches that might make big enough differences to matter, and gene therapies. There's a whole range of ways that you could conceivably restore hematopoiesis to a more youthful level in the bone marrow. Secondly, the thymus, I think we're all familiar with what can be done there by now. In the thymus, actually, there's so many ways of regrowing it. The challenge is entirely, again, targeting. You can't inject the thymus because the mortality rate would be too high. But if you could, there's any number of things you could stick in the thymus that would regrow it. I mean, KGF, growth hormone, you could put in some sort of steroid ablation into the thymus, so that would also work. And the list goes on. Your problem is entirely 100% delivery, and Greg Fahy's group is doing just about the only thing you can do in humans, probably, setting aside the cavencin peptides, where it's very unclear as to whether they are actually capable of immune rejuvenation. Somebody needs to run a study. There's one going on at the moment, but I don't think they're actually testing people's thymuses, which is the standard annoying story of most of these approaches, which is that there's great data out there for improved immune function, but nobody did the CT scans. So somebody should run that study. The other part of killing off peripheral immune cells, and I should say the thymus and the bone marrow talk to each other, both directions. We understand how the bone marrow talks to the thymus. So if you restore thymus, the generation of cells in the bone marrow, some of them go to the thymus and actually bring signals with them, and the thymus will tend to slow its involution or grow as a result. We don't know how the reverse works, but it appears that there is a connection between thymic regrowth and improved hematopoiesis in the bone marrow. So there's a study for anybody who's looking for something to do in the academic field. The final one is, okay, so you have all these pathological immune populations that may or may not decline if you restore the thymus. It's very unclear. And so ideally what you'd want to do is wipe the whole thing out. And there's a fellow who's been doing that for autoimmune conditions for a while, using very drastic approaches that no one would ever want to undergo, which is basically chemotherapy. And it's not fun chemotherapy, and it comes with like serious risks. So only like severe diseases were actually being treated like that, like multiple sclerosis. But you can make things like type 1 diabetes and multiple sclerosis go away for 3 to 10 years by deleting somebody's peripheral immune system, because that's where some of the information is stored about how the immune system is going wrong. Now, if they've done the experiments where, for example, you clear B cells in the periphery or microglia in the brain. And those are two great ones to get rid of because they come back very quickly, and they come back without all the damage that the old ones had. So that's great. It works really well. Somebody should do that. Clearing the rest of it is a little bit more of an interesting problem. There are some ways forward. There is actually a really good marker that only immune cells have. And if the Entos ocean suicide gene therapy delivered via lipid nanoparticle was better at actually getting at immune cells in circulation, it's not very good at that. That would be a good option for a gene therapy to clear the problematic peripheral immune system. But there's lots of ways you want to go about this. And so I think and any one of these things would be beneficial in and of itself. So I think there's tremendous room for an industry of people doing interesting things here. And to a certain extent, there is a small industry of people doing interesting things here, just not a big enough one. Yes, I was with Robert. I was talking about Richard Burt.
Okay, and again here, like what could someone do who is actually trying to help?
So I always dread to say the help part is give me money or give someone else money. But honestly, there's not enough investment in this field in the biotech space. Go find some biotechs doing something you like and invest in them. I mean, there's a bunch of us, and many of us are doing good things. So go chat to these people and see if you like what they're doing. And if you do, invest in their companies. I think that immune rejuvenation is a very high expectation value approach. So with many indications that one could conceivably target. And even if you're building a clinical business, such as Intervene Immune, it's still a very worthwhile goal. So take a look at what's out there, I think.
Well, if I now heard this and I didn't necessarily have a background, I would be like, yo, how do I take a look?
How do you take a look? Well, you can always bug me and I can point you in the direction of some people. This is, I guess, one of those things where I need to write a document and say, okay, look, these guys are doing stuff. Kind of how it goes. Another document of the many documents that I probably owe the world at this point.
Yeah, there is also Carl Pfleger's agingbiotech.info, which lists like a really good comprehensive overview of a variety of different companies.
Yes, and I'm very thankful to him for doing that, because I just wouldn't have the time and energy at this point to keep up that one. I think he's beginning to realize how much of a job he's set for himself here.
Well, hopefully, it also lists by some community nominations also. So, but definitely, I mean, he's not only keeping it up to date, but he's just spinning out more and more individual sub-tabs. I'll share the link here in the, he's saying he doesn't have time anymore. Carl, I don't know if you want to say anything to that, or if you have like a request for how people can plug in there. Feel free to if you want to.
I'll just say that, I've been adding new tabs, but not keeping up with the companies tab. And updates to the companies list coming in 2022, but also the beginnings of crowdsourcing. Not full Wikifcation, but crowdsourcing based on volunteers who get blessed and with code reviews by me to make sure that the info going on is okay. But that's the upcoming to-do list for 2022.
That's great.
Very cool. I'm excited to hear that. Okay, I shared the link here in the chat as well, and I think Carl just also, in addition to that, launched blogs, books, conferences, and so forth. So it's a pretty comprehensive start. So
any last minute questions here? We have like 9 minutes to go.
I think Steve opened up the thread again about the FDA. So I don't know, Steve, if you want to hammer down on this again.
If anybody wants to hear stories about historical examples of how the FDA has subverted their own process and both laws and constitutional provisions, for example, they've been cited like 4 times for violations of free speech, even commercial free speech, specifically focused on that issue. And they're still doing it. So, the decision hasn't gone to the Supreme Court. It's only been 4 circuit court decisions. So the FDA doesn't really care. They've got a kind of sacred cow position in the United States. And so they basically do what they want to do regardless. So this whole idea that they're about minimizing harm, I think, is basically public relations.
Indeed. I mean, minimizing harm is exactly the opposite of what they do. in practice once you account for the invisible graveyard, as somebody said up there. Nobody has their nice bureaucratic career disrupted for not approving a drug, unfortunately. But that's the system we work in. Either you play this game or you figure out a way to make medical tourism work. And that's obviously, that's on the list. We need to figure that out because medical tourism is the only form of competition for these highly regulated systems in the wealthier parts of the world, highly regulated and corrupt systems. And the only way to make them better is by having, a lot of therapies being done outside the country and consequent pressure. And that's what happened for stem cell therapies, and with some success, I feel. But equally, it's not entirely 100%, a crusade that worked in that case. The real picture is a lot more complex on the ground.
Oh, we have a question from Mika in the chat on thoughts of things that could be done to make this work.
Let me insert one brief comment here about the possibility of tourism offshore. This is something that isn't really well developed because of a certain amount of infrastructure, but as long as medical therapy takes place beyond the 12-mile limit, it's theoretically at least independent, and that wouldn't be so far for people to go.
Yeah, the whole get a ship and park it offshore exercise that some people have been thinking about and actually costs a lot more than you might think. But okay, so Nicola, I think you had a comment.
Just a word of caution, because I think we have a responsibility in a field that is relatively young. We all saw what happened with the vaccines in last year. We came with a solution and the general public was extremely skeptical, and very easily the opinion rejected something that was approved by the FDA, that was supported by the science. So if we open the door to just go around the regulations and use medical tourism to go and implement our modes, we need to accept the fact that we're not a homogeneous community. It's very heterogeneous. And there will be also charlatans, which will come in, pull people out, give them treatments that will give really, really bad reputation to the entire field.
I fear that we already have the charlatan community actively doing their thing within the supplement space. And indeed, one doesn't have to go too far to find people who are selling things that won't do a great deal of good. So you can't, as I said at the meeting in person, you can't stop evil. It doesn't matter what you do. One has to forge ahead and do the best one can. Anton, you had a comment?
I mean, as I am kind of involved not only in aging, but also in autoimmunity and cultured meat, what I see is that if some nonprofits are very reputable, they actually manage to oversight things happening in many companies. And it happens in cultured meat, and we get a lot of insights because nonprofits interact with companies and make some reports and research with very confidential things because everybody trusts them. And in terms of medical tourism, I mean, the problem is that companies try to cut corners to minimize cost. And I mean that if we want to make it safe, maybe it makes sense to create a reputable nonprofit that will assess the processes of gene therapies in medical tourism, aging-related, regenerative medicine-related companies, and give them like a star rating. And in such case, if many companies will go through this procedure, and if there will be reputable safety experts in this nonprofit, maybe it can make situation easier with medical tourism.
there's certainly like the incentive problems there are a challenge. This has been discussed in the past with a number of people. You'd kind of probably have to set it up as a concierge organization that controlled the relationship with the patient, because the clinics have no incentive to participate in this scheme. It's a challenging one. Johnny?
Yeah, on the idea of taking a boat out past the 12-mile limit, yeah, that's a great idea. I was on one once, and yeah, it was a beautiful day. There were dolphins swimming. That's the upside. Just make sure you get a rather large, stable boat like a trawler, because you know, the ocean is not like, you know, like a building. There will be rocking. One subject became seasick and uncomfortable, so just be aware of that.
Yeah, nothing's perfect.
I was going to suggest that that a cruise ship would be a better operation, where the infrastructure is already financed and earning a profit, and just sublet a fraction of that operation to run your clinic, and that way you can expand it in proportion to what the demand is.
Oh, great. Out here in California, Catalina has regular runs from Los Angeles down to Ensenada, something like that.
I think in addition to, you know, setting up medical tourism, I think that one thing that Dylan Livingston with the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives will be focused on in the next year, as we've heard in the last session, is just really trying to lobby for more sane policies in that regard. So, reason I would love to know from you, just, you know, what types of things, you know, what do you think we should try to get the FDA to do, or what's a sensible?
Well, I am a cynic's cynic when it comes to government. I think the only thing that government responds to is competition outside its dominion. Medical tourism is the only way to reform the FDA meaningfully in any way, shape, or form. Otherwise, play the game and just accept what they do. Lobbying is a tremendous waste of time, in my view. I do not think it's anywhere near as effective as attempting to just go do your thing in a competitive way in another country. And that's really the way it goes.
Reason, do you have a particular jurisdictional FDA analog that you think is the most likely to be the one to, you know, go in the directions we want first?
There are. This is a sliding scale, Carl. It's a so you can go to Canada or Australia and reduce your regulatory costs by a factor of 2, and that is already applying some pressure to the FDA in terms of limiting how much they can keep increasing the costs and difficulty. But to do it more than that, you know, you need to like expand Panama, which is a decent place for clinics, or Bahamas, as was mentioned earlier. Thailand and Vietnam and India are all, like, you know, somewhere on the spectrum between Bahamas and Panama and Canada. So there isn't anywhere where you're getting you have freedom. You could certainly go to one of these corrupt Caribbean nations and convince them to let you do something, and as soon as you got bad press, they would shut you down. And that's happened. That you have to have a certain amount of stability to do this stuff. And
I mean, I think one thing that just happened with Prospera, right, where they're already trying to set up shop, which is in Honduras, is that now they have a new like a new head of government in place who's against Prospera existing, or has made that as one of their first, I think, moves in office. And so I think that instability is also what really shot the seasteading movement in the foot when they went to Tahiti. They had at least like an initial agreement that this could work, and then the government changed, and I think
so you're trading off low regulation against instability and risk to the venture, in effect, which is why most people have looked at this and said, okay, let's just go do our clinical trials in Canada if they're really kind of interested in avoiding some of the FDA troubles. Going further than that needs more work if you're not doing it very under the radar as a small scale operation.
We did have Brian Kennedy and a few others here last year, which I just shared as a link in the chat, to speak about the Singaporean approach, because apparently they have a good model of just how to actually have government much more aligned with the companies that they're producing, and there were quite some interesting learnings from them.
So I think Stephen and Nicola had further comments.
One of the big problems with dealing with small countries that may be somewhat unstable is that there are often bribes that are involved, which is not something that is compatible with U.S. Practices and stuff like that. But the point I wanted to make earlier is that because the FDA's drug approval standards are not written down anywhere, they're not published in the Federal Register under the Administrative Procedures Act, there ends up being a double standard that's applied between big drug companies that have a low barrier to things and small innovative pharmaceutical companies that have a high barrier. And that barrier can be raised arbitrarily to force those companies to sell out to bigger drug companies. And so this is one of those reasons that it's necessary to put pressure on the FDA by tourism to bypass that kind of arbitrary and capricious, standards.
Right. Regulatory capture at its best. Nicola?
Stephen said exactly what I wanted to say, except for the conclusion. If you look at the statistics, when small companies try a first application and they get rejection, on the reapplication, they have much higher chance to get accepted. And for just an example, we once had, we wanted to change the electrode that we use for brain implants, and we wanted to move from silver to gold. And we got hit with biocompatibility. Gold is much less reactive than silver. It's obvious, but someone somewhere has to read in the application the keyword that says gold is biocompatible. And so I think something that can be done, and that goes together with Alison's question, is to have a tool where we can help companies have better applications, because that's very much a legal element. The person that, the bureaucrat that is reading those applications, they don't really care about understanding the purpose of it. They need to see the keyword. They need to see the right word there, and they only have so much freedom to approve or disapprove something. And so if we help companies have better applications, that might actually streamline the process.
All right, thank you. Oh, Wiesen, did you want to respond to this?
No.
Okay, good. Well, we're now already 5 minutes of time.
Who here has at least a little knowledge and expertise and really wants to make an offshore clinic go? I know we're getting cut off. Email me, jadams@grg.org. We need to talk. Thank you.
Can you put it in the chat?
Will do.
Lovely. So last question that everyone here always gets pestered with is, what are you working on right now, and how can this group really help your work forward? So what is it really that that would help accelerate your work? Wiesen, you've been doing so much for the community. Like, this is your opportunity to say what would help you.
Right. Depressingly money. My primary work right now is Repair Biotechnologies. We would love to be able to get into clinical trials by the end of 2023, and that requires a great deal of funding. So I'm interested in introductions to people of all sorts, family offices, high net worth individuals, angels, funds who are interested in the cardiovascular space. Atherosclerosis kills a quarter of everybody in the environment of today, in which nearly everybody takes statins who can take statins. We need to deal with this condition. It's a major cause of human mortality, and the best thing that can be done to help us advance to the point at which we can greatly crush down that mortality risk is getting over the next funding hurdle for our company and taking us into our first clinical trials. And that's a very depressing answer, that like money makes the world go round, but that is what it is. And connections are always appreciated.
How can they contact you?
They can contact me, reason@repairbiotechnologies.com. You can find a contact address also for the company in general, which goes to me as well at on the website repairbiotechnologies.com. I can drop that in the chat. So if you have any connections or thoughts, always happy to hear from people.